will it take to stabilize the Korean Peninsula? My name is Sridhar Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, a transpartisan think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and toward rigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. While there is much focus on President Biden's decision as to whether to honor the Doha Agreement in Afghanistan and end the American involvement in that 20-year-long war, there is far less attention given to another war that is now entering its 70th year, the Korean War. More than 70 years since the Korean War began, the Korean Peninsula technically still remains in a state of war. Why is that? What can and should the United States do to bring an end to that war and stabilize the peninsula? And what specifically can and should the Biden administration do as it now takes office? To address these important questions, we're delighted to have an excellent panel that includes Congressman Ted Lieu of California, Dr. Chung-in, who until very recently was a special advisor to President Moon Jae-in, and QI's own Jess Lee. Professor John Delury of Yonsei University will moderate the conversation. For those of you who are joining us via Zoom, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and John will try to get to those questions throughout the conversation. If you are watching via Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, you can put your questions in the comment section, and we will try to get to those as well. So with no further ado, please welcome Professor Delury, who will introduce the panel and start the conversation. Professor?
Yes, well, thank you very much, Trita. I'm certainly delighted to be part of this and in the moderating role, and I'll certainly do my job of bringing the questions in from all those out there. So please do participate through the chat. I think we couldn't just briefly say we couldn't be at a better time. As we know, the Biden administration is conducting its North Korea policy review, and I would say being here, I've been in South Korea for 10 years now. And I think it's fair to say there's a lot of eager anticipation, maybe some anxiety as we sort of await the results and hopefully have input and discussion exactly like this discussion as that review is happening. And so the timing is great, and the people could not be better chosen to have a representative, important one from Congress, and to have such an important voice from the South Korean public sphere in Professor Moon. So I don't want to take up time. I want to get the spotlight over to them. And what I'd like to do is start off by asking Congressman Lieu to get us started. He's really established himself as a leading voice, especially in terms of envisioning a progressive foreign policy for the United States and what that could look like. He's thought about these issues. He's worked on legislation on the Korean conflict, on nuclear weapons policy and use. And so we know he's thought a lot about these issues and has a lot to say. And so maybe we could start with you, Congressman, if you could share your thoughts.
So thank you, Professor Delury, for that introduction. I want to thank the Quincy Institute for inviting me and for setting up this excellent panel. So honored to be on here with Dr. Moon and Michael Swaine, see you as well. And Jessica Lee, thank you also for being here. I previously served on active duty in the United States Air Force. So I'm not opposed to war, but I am opposed to stupid wars and wars that the United States cannot win. My view is the United States cannot win a war in North Korea. And so I'm going to sort of just explain some of the reasons why, and why that then leads me to a view that we've got to use everything else to try to achieve peace, because a war would be catastrophic. So all of you, I'm sure, remember Desert Storm. And when you remember that war, what happened in the first few weeks? Well, you saw weeks and weeks of airstrikes from the coalition before any ground invasion went in. Problem is, when the US tries to do that, or with other allies tries to do that in North Korea, if there were to be a war, this is what would happen. So we do know that North Korea has nuclear weapons. The only way to effectively take out those nuclear weapons would be through a ground invasion. Well, you wouldn't do a ground invasion without first using your air assets to try to neutralize the opponent as much as you can, also get air superiority and so on. So while the US is trying to do that, what North Korea would do is take the huge amount of artillery that they have and constantly shell Seoul and other places in South Korea 24 hours a day for day after day after day after day. And all these war games basically show that hundreds of thousands of people will die in South Korea, including US military troops and US civilians who are sitting there, who are living in South Korea. Also, some of the artillery that North Korea has are these sort of guns that they have in these mountains, and they pull them out of the mountains, they shoot their artillery shells over the mountains, lands in South Korea, and then they put the artillery weapon back into the mountains, which also makes it sort of hard for airplanes to try to knock out those weapons. So while the US is trying to do what it can to achieve air superiority and also gain other assets and destroy them in North Korea, lots of people are dying in South Korea. And that's why everyone who looks at this, this is even before we talk about nuclear weapons. I mean, North Korea could also just flat out use nuclear weapons in the middle of this conflict, and that would also have catastrophic loss of life. So everyone who's looked at this has basically concluded we have no good military options in North Korea. So that's why I think we have to use diplomacy. We saw last term that it wasn't really diplomacy, it was sort of this weird relationship that the former president was trying to build with the current North Korean leader that never actually went anywhere. Because as of now, we know that North Korea has not, in fact, reduced any nuclear weapon stockpile. They have not reduced any ballistic missiles. They have not gotten rid of their chemical weapon stockpile. The public reporting is the fact they have increased nuclear fuel. So last term was not particularly successful. I do hope that the Biden administration will now set out a strategy and then use appropriate diplomatic channels to achieve that strategy of having peace in the Korean Peninsula. With that, happy to answer any questions you may have, and so honored you invited me to speak.
Well, great, thank you. That gets us started off. I certainly have a bunch of follow-ups to that, and there will be others. I'm thinking maybe let's get a round in of the group, and then we'll circle back, Congressman, if that sounds all right.
Yes.
Professor Moon, I think you've described yourself recently as a progressive realist, which sounds like it fits the bill well, and certainly a leading figure voice over here in the South Korean discussion of North Korea and a whole range of foreign affairs issues. Do you want to share your thoughts on this question of the war that hasn't ended, and how to end it, and where we move forward now jointly, the United States and South Korea? Professor Moon.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful event. And I agree with Congressman Liu's observation 100%, even more than 100%. I remember President Reagan's the famous word, the war that cannot be fought, that cannot be won. Because when we deal with North Korea, we are really talking about nuclear war. Therefore, they can be fought and they cannot be won. And collateral damages are so humongous. Therefore, even we cannot, dare to venture into that kind of, military, maneuver on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, I agree with Congressman Liu's observation 100%. Then what are the options? And Congressman Liu said that the diplomacy is the only option. I agree with Congressman Liu. Then what can you do that? Then Queen's report recently published the East Asia Strategy Report. There are two items. One item is we got to deal with the North Korean nuclear problem. Then how to do it? And Queen's Institute report made it very clear. We need to have incremental, phased approach to North Korean nuclear problem with the principle of action for action, simultaneous exchanges. And I think that is the only way. Now we have in Washington, there are other views too, dismantle first, and then we'll reward you. Until that time, that we come up with the maximum pressures and increase the sanctions. And I don't think that will work, okay? Because North Korea has nuclear weapons, then how they can dismantle without firm assurance from the United States. Another approach is wait and see approach, which people call the stable management of North Korean nuclear issues. I would say that a lot of people in the Biden administration will take that position. let us see. Let us go through the policy review, and then let us see what kinds of behavior North Korea shows. If North Korea provokes, we retaliate in kind. If North Korea shows good behavior, we may consider doing diplomacy. Okay, but in the process, then Biden administration may go back to old strategic patience approach, which we do not want, right? Because that strategic patience approach didn't produce any tangible outcomes. Therefore, again, going back to Quincy's report on the East Asian strategy, we got to have a more meaningful approach, sensible approach with sheer realism. That is, I agree that with that approach. Another item which I found very interesting in the report is about idea of so-called getting rid of American forces from South Korea and ending the alliance and etc. But that's a too much radical approach. But that report really raised a fundamental theoretical question on security architecture in East Asia. That is what? Should we continue alliance-based approach in the region? It is called the collective defense system approach. Then we got to constantly invent enemies, common enemies and common threats. Can we do that? But by creating common enemies and common threat, can we get out of perpetual security dilemma? That is one question. Then what is alternative? Now go back to the United Nations Charter that stipulate the collective security arrangement. And prelude to collective security system is multilateral security cooperation approach. And that really signals a paradigmatic change in our strategic thinking. Can we change from the alliance system to some sort of multilateral security cooperation regime? Perhaps a more powerful CSIS, OSCE model, Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe model. Can the US accept it? I'm quite doubt. Those in Washington would hate that kind of multilateral cooperation approach. But in South Korea, there is a growing number of intellectuals and NGOs that argue that what is really value of American alliance? Can we find the peace and prosperity in the region without having alliance? Can we have some kinds of new security architecture under the American leadership? And I think that is the most important question. It is an American domestic question. If United States takes that kind of leadership, then we'll have a complete different security landscape in East Asia. We can have, Immanuel Kant's hold this perpetual peace on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, I'm really hoping for it. Therefore, as to your first suggestion for peace on the Korean Peninsula, I am 100% with Quincy's report. But as to the idea of getting rid of American forces from South Korea and terminating alliance, that seems to be too idealistic, what some people call the progressive idealist view, okay? But we can have some sense of realism there by inventing new security architecture. And I think that is the issue we should be deliberating on in years to come. I'll stop here.
Well, great. Thank you. Professor Moon does the homework. He obviously read the report. We have two authors of the report, and it's a great segue to bring Jessica Lee and Michael Swaine in, I think, here. If the two of you want to comment, maybe Jessica, we could start with you to pick up on some of Dr. Moon's points. And then Michael, if you want on Korea specifically, and then Michael, if you want to broaden out a little bit and bring in some of the regional issues, because of course your report is looking at East Asia as a whole and a US strategy in the region. And then Congressman, we'll have plenty ready to come back to you for the second round. So Jessica.
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you so much, Dr. Moon and Congressman Lieu. It's an honor to be on the same panel as all of you. Thank you for your time. So when Michael Swaine, Rachel Esplin-Odell, and I began writing this report last fall, we were in the middle of a presidential campaign. And much of what candidate Joe Biden and his top advisors were saying about East Asia hinted, broadly speaking, at a return to diplomacy as a central tool of American statecraft. After years of watching the State Department budget get slashed and President Trump's budget requests only to be made whole by Congress, I thought this was much needed. It also aligns with the premise of the Quincy Institute, which is to promote foreign policy ideas that are less militarized, less about seeking dominance and primacy everywhere, and more about cooperation and collaboration. And yes, multilateralism, as Dr. Moon insisted. On North Korea, we saw Joe Biden pledge to engage in what he called principled diplomacy toward a denuclearized North Korea, as well as a unified Korean Peninsula, while working to reunite Korean American families separated from the war. That was an actual quote from an op-ed that he wrote. And having personally worked on divided Korean American families issues, as well as POW/MIA groups, who are advocating for, retrieval of remains of Americans that are unaccounted for in North Korea, excuse me. I was so pleased to hear, candidate Biden connect the North Korea issue, not so much as a foreign policy abstraction, but something that concerns everyday Americans here at home. And what the outcome of non-engagement between the two countries has meant for Americans. We're about third way into the first 100 days of the Biden administration. And the team, I think, is, as Dr. Moon noted, conducting a North Korea policy review. And our report offers a roadmap for the administration to what we hope, will be sort of an advancement of peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, where the United States, technically remains at war to this day. And there are, obviously many things that are on top of mind in this administration, especially with the COVID pandemic raging in the United States. More Americans have died from this pandemic than World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War combined. But the peace on Korean Peninsula is also long overdue and requires immediate action in our view. As former Deputy Secretary Steve Biegun said in his speech in Seoul, the Korean War is over, the time for conflict has ended, and the time for peace has arrived. And so our report specifically, as Dr. Moon alluded to, recommends a North Korea strategy that's based on more realistic short and medium term goals that are rooted in peace and denuclearization. We can go into more details. And then, additionally, we recommend that the United States, begin to imagine an East Asia foreign policy where we defer more to our allies, like South Korea, to eventually take greater control over their own affairs. Ideally, over time, a non-nuclear unified Korean Peninsula would emerge free from external forces in consultation with the United States and relevant powers in the region. But the more likely scenario is a devastating war, as Congressman Lieu alluded to, whether it's provoked by Pyongyang's behavior or some sort of an implosion of the regime. Either of these scenarios would likely lead to a prolonged period of instability on the peninsula and possibly a Sino-US confrontation as well. And that's why we recommend repeatedly in the report for consultation and frequent dialogue among stakeholders on a peaceful way forward on the peninsula, whether it's divided or not. In particular, cooperation between the United States and China is going to be very useful in this regard and very important, as Dr. Swaine, I'm sure, will mention. Rather than be locked in a zero-sum competition, Washington and Beijing have to recognize that they're shared in their shared interest in a Korean peninsula that's stable. Both countries would benefit from North Korea being economically open, politically stable, and nuclear free. To be clear, North Korea is not likely to denuclearize tomorrow or in the near future, and will likely want to maintain some element of nuclear capabilities. But that does not preclude establishing a stable relationship with the world's two largest economies. In many ways, the Korean Peninsula is the product of a military-centered US foreign policy. In addition to artillery systems Congressman Lieu alluded to, the 150-mile-long DMZ and surrounding areas are covered by 1 million landmines, which were laid by US and ROK forces during and after the Korean War. Next Monday actually marks the 22nd anniversary of the Mine Ban Treaty. And while the US isn't a signatory of that treaty, it has restrained itself from using this deadly weapon worldwide as a matter of policy, except on the Korean Peninsula. And then the Trump administration actually lifted that self-embargo to be allowed to be used anywhere. And so Quincy Institute, as a member of the US campaign to ban landmines, has advocated for a ban on this deadly weapon, including at the DMZ. And of course, this and many other things we're talking about are going to take decades and years of work by diplomats. And I think that work needs to start now. Finally, in 2018, North and South Koreas actually worked together on a small demining project. And so the United States should support, such confidence building measures between the two Koreas that physically help to demilitarize the DMZ and hopefully the broader peninsula going forward. So I'll stop there and turn to Dr. Swaine for some additional remarks about the report. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Michael, do you want to weigh in? Obviously, China does have the attention in U.S.-China relations in a way that maybe North Korea policy doesn't right now. How do you see the Korea question fitting in to the current tendencies in Sino-U.S. relations?
Thank you, John. Thanks very much. A pleasure to be part of this event this morning on the East Coast. Yes, the report provides a good framework, I think, for understanding the Korea issue. And obviously, as people have already said, it argues for actions to be taken by the United States that would reduce the possibility of instability and arms racing between the United States and China in Asia, and thereby reduce the potential for volatile issues such as the Korea issue to become a source of rivalry between the United States and China. Now, while we see the really unavoidable need for some level of competition with China in some areas, primarily economic and technological, we don't see, or we don't believe that so-called great power strategic competition should frame US foreign and security policy. We need to create, as I say, a more stable Asia, not a deepening Sino-US rivalry that can undermine so many issues across the region. So the East Asia Strategy Report offers some solutions or some ways to achieve greater stability in East Asia. But let me just say a few comments first about what we see the region doing that really should frame and condition the way in which the United States develops its strategy. We see in the report that the emergence of three major trends have occurred in Asia that are really having a major impact on US policy and the policies of all other major players. The first, of course, is a shift in the regional balance of power. We focus on this quite a bit in the report. And that, of course, is primarily between China and the United States. The important point about this is that it has ended a nearly 70-year-long period of American military and economic primacy in Asia. However, at the same time, it hasn't resulted in Chinese dominance of the region either. Neither the United States nor China are going to be able to dominate the East Asia region in the future, we believe. And we also don't believe that US maritime military predominance will be recoverable, absent a major decline in Chinese capabilities. So, unless it's made stable, there's going to be an unstable balance of power in East Asia that will increase the chances for crises as the US and China vie to test one another's resolve or react to incidents such as over sovereignty disputes, thus increasing the chance of miscalculations in the form of, for example, overconfidence by China as its relative power increases and overreaction by the United States as it seeks to disabuse China and others that its relative power has been declining. Second major factor that we see in the region is what we've been alluding to, increasing tensions over specific issues, Korea, Taiwan, maritime sovereignty disputes, in part resulting from the shifting balance between the US and China, and made much worse by that intensifying competition, but also because of a rising nationalism in some countries that is gaining more importance, domestic change occurring in some areas, such as on Taiwan, that are undermining the idea of the possibility of unification between Taiwan and the mainland. And then, of course, North Korea's drive for nuclear weapons to compensate for its lost conventional military power and to give it greater diplomatic leverage and security. And then finally, we see a growing level of transnational challenges. We're already living through one of them right now: pandemics, climate change, economic related challenges, global economic challenges that are really changing the whole definition of what it means to have national security. It goes far beyond narrow military state-to-state relations to include what we regard as even greater, more urgent security threats that face all nations and require some level of meaningful, credible, and extensive cooperation among nations, including between the United States and China. Now, I'll just end by saying that in the report, in very broad terms, we cite 4 different areas where the United States needs to really adopt a different policy. The first, it has to adopt defensive military balancing, not offensive, preemptive oriented, deep strike oriented types of military posture. We need to have what we call a denial posture, a more defensive denial posture, not control posture in the Western Pacific. And secondly, we need to have much greater levels of diplomatic, economic engagement in the region, reforming the WTO and expanding it, and also entering into other economic and technology regimes, including the CPTPP, and increasing economic integration across the region that can help to reinforce the incentives for stability and for avoidance of conflict. And then third, we need a more feasible, targeted, multilateral approach to the issue of human rights, which is a big issue for the Biden administration and for the United States. We have to have this done in a multilateral context, however, by all Asians and directed at all Asian states that are, some of which are American allies that are engaged in human rights abuses, not just China, but also, of course, by improving America's own human rights record and its own image as a model for a nation organized by human rights. And then last but not least, we emphasize very much the need for American economic and political revival. Many people refer to this, but it is so crucial. If the United States wishes to remain highly competitive and a major presence and a reassuring presence in East Asia and in other areas of the world, it really has to improve its game domestically. It has to improve its economic competitiveness, but even more importantly, it has to improve its image in the world, which has been so badly damaged over the last 4 years. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you. And to all the speakers in that round. I mean, I can't summarize and wouldn't want to, but to distill, I think we have sort of two categories of this discussion. One centering around strategic questions of sort of the region and how does it fit together and what's the US role. And then the other, more narrowly, maybe a policy discussion about, sort of what to do about North Korea, what to do about peace and denuclearization going forward with the Biden administration. So I do want to come back to you, Congressman. Of course, the policy and strategy are hard to separate, but if we can maybe try to focus on the policy question, I also want, if you don't mind, I want to bring in some questions from those of you who are out there participating, specifically, I think for you, Congressman, related to this, to get your ideas about where the policy should go. So Jesse Johnson, journalist with the Japan Times, asks the question about the fact that there are proponents of arms control or threat reduction approach who argue there's little to lose, especially with initial low impact, low cost actions. And so what do you think of an arms control framework for dealing with North Korea? And how can we trust Pyongyang, considering their long history of cheating on earlier deals? And related to that, from Ryan, a question to you, Congressman, where do you stand on providing the DPRK with security assurances in exchange for normalized relations and thereby fundamentally altering the problem? So I think what people want to know is, how would you advise the Biden administration going forward on the policy question of North Korea?
Thank you for those questions. So I'll answer the first question. Nothing we should do should be based on trust with North Korea. It has to be on actions that can be verified. So you can do lots of things with other countries that you don't do it based on trust. You simply based on verification. So you can still have agreements. You can still take actions on both sides that will move both sides forward, along with South Korea to achieving peace, that you simply based on verification of action. So I'm fully supportive of any low-level actions that will increase confidence. So let me take a step back. I am on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and also on the Asia Subcommittee. And so we'll be looking at this issue this term. But I want folks to think about sort of the following context we're in. On any given day, Russia and China can obliterate the United States with nuclear weapons. They can launch them, and then a lot of people in the United States would die, and it would change our society and the world as we know it. The reason that China and Russia don't do that is they know that we have enough of a second strike capability to launch back and obliterate them. Well, you got North Korea here, which is far smaller than either China or Russia. And they know if they launch any nuclear weapons at us or at South Korea, they will be obliterated. So if you take the view that the leader of North Korea is not suicidal, then you might take the view that, look, he's not going to do that. And we can then deter North Korea the same way we deter China or Russia or any other countries that wants to do us or our allies harm. So if you sort of take the view that, okay, maybe we can't actually just go in and make North Korea denuclearize right now. If that's not something that's achievable really in the near or medium term, then why don't we look at ways we can stabilize the situation to make it even less likely that a leader of North Korea is going to feel compelled to use nuclear weapons or want to do very bad things? And what sorts of actions and policy can we do to do that? So that transitions to my answer to the second question, which is, even though every situation is different, there is at least one example of a country giving up their nuclear weapons when they felt safe. That was South Africa. So as all of you know, in the 1980s, based on public reporting, South Africa had at least 6 nuclear bombs. They dismantled them. They actually got rid of the nuclear program. And it's because they came to the conclusion that they were safe enough that they did not need nuclear weapons. So I think in the long term, if you're going to get North Korea to denuclearize, they've got to feel safe. They got to feel like they no longer need these nuclear weapons, or at least not so many of them. And so I would certainly look at various security assurances that we give to North Korea to eventually go to the long-term goal of denuclearization.
And if I can follow up and just press you a little, or probe a little bit more on diplomacy, how quickly, how boldly do you think the Biden administration needs to be on this? And also, trying to reflect the view in Congress and talking with your colleagues, what kind of appetite is there in Congress to see a really proactive approach on North Korea? Or is it, as Professor Moon was suggesting, there's a lot of tendency toward his sort of second option of, well, let's wait and see, and are they going to be on good behavior, then maybe okay. How would you describe the view that you have from Congress?
So Dr. Moon mentioned realism. I honestly think the U.S. might just wait to see what the next administration is going to be like in South Korea, because we need to have a partner in South Korea. And depending on what that administration is, I think it might inform our behavior going forward as to how aggressive or not aggressive we would be in taking some of those lower level actions.
Very interesting. Professor Moon, can we come back to you on this issue of, well, first of all, the questions about, what's the fundamental framework here? As you know, in the expert community, there's more and more voices, as one of the questions implied, saying, look, it's an arms control issue. And denuclearization is really unrealistic. And everyone needs to accept that we're not actually talking about denuclearization of North Korea. We are ultimately managing this problem. Are your views on that changing, or do you think we can achieve it and we need to be focused on achieving it, and therefore we need a bolder diplomacy to get there? What is your view at present?
In my view, there is no other alternative but in a so-called arms control approach. But here, issue is this: once you pursue arms control approach, then it is assumed that we recognize North Korea as a de facto nuclear weapon state. But that is not true. We can be aware of North Korean nuclear weapons capability, but we cannot recognize North Korea's nuclear weapon state. Okay. And then what is all about arms control approach? You start with, as Siegfried Hecker suggested, you start with so-called halting North Korean activities. Yesterday, 38 notes showed that the North Korea has been enriching its uranium in Yongbyon. We got to stop it. And we give us some kind of reward for their freezing activities. And then we move on to rollback. Again, we give us some incentive to North Korea for rollback. Then third stage will be the stage of dismantling. You start with the nuclear facilities, nuclear materials, and nuclear warhead. Nuclear warhead would be the last card the North Korea would use. We give a set of incentive, whether there be a sanction relief or normalization between Washington and Pyongyang, or there could be the so-called peace regime going through the adoption of end of the war declaration, transformation of armistice agreement into peace regime, in whatever, or allowing North Korea to have access to international society, whatever. Therefore, my basic suggestion is this. Trump might have a problem, but the Singapore Declaration on June 12, 2018 was a good start. Okay, if you look at the Singapore Declaration, Article 1 is what? Normalized relations between the US and DPRK. Article 2 is all about creating lasting peace regime on the Korean Peninsula. Third, both sides will make effort towards the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Those are very important starting point. And also go back to Hanoi. North Korea came up with very specific proposals. Of course, then President Trump just dismissed it, okay? Adopting so-called all or nothing approach. But Biden administration should look at North Korean proposal in detail, okay? And I think it's not late, okay? Therefore, now my basic argument is this, the Biden administration need to pursue more realistic and sensible approach, okay? And U.S. cannot be in the position of so-called commanding height, ordering North Korea to this and to that. It would be extremely difficult for U.S. to compel North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. Therefore, U.S. should devise more strategic, realistic strategy in dealing with North Korea.
John, can I jump in as well before we move on?
Please,
okay,
Jessica.
thank you. I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to go back to a point Congressman Lieu made. I think in general, what he said, particularly on South Africa and sort of, the points that he made about pressure, using incentives, I think are all spot on. I think the only area I would just have a slight disagreement with what he said was regarding, the fact that, as he noted, South Korean President Moon Jae-in's term is ending in about a year. And we'll have to see who the next president is. That's definitely true. I would just say that it seems very clear, at least from here in Washington, that the South Korean president is very much committed to the process of diplomacy, particularly on the inter-Korean front, but also between US and North Korea. So President Moon, it seems, is a willing and able and capable partner of the United States in this effort and in this endeavor. So it seems to me like if President Biden is looking for an ally and partner on this, he's already got a really good one. But of course, as Congressman Lieu knows, as the election process begins, perhaps there will be some domestic, distractions and so forth that make it slightly more difficult. But I think in general, if President Biden wants to take this bold approach that Kirk Campbell and others and his team had suggested, I think he has a very strong partner in South Korea to help him.
Thank you, Jessica.
To bring in some of the regional strategy, and I'm also noticing questions from the group in the Q&A on this. We've talked a little bit about the China piece. Another one is Japan. We have a question from Mark Takola. What is the effect of declining Japanese and South Korean trust in US extended deterrence? Is that destabilizing, or might it provoke a useful conversation? And of course, that when we talk about alliances from a U.S. perspective, the trilateral framework is always there. Sometimes the elephant in the room. There has been an initial conversation between the three teams on, I think, the North Korea issue. So that's positive. But are there thoughts in the group? If any of you want to weigh in, again, if we kind of broaden out to look at how does a diplomatic approach, depending on how aggressive or patient you want it to be, how does it fit with relations with Japan, as well as if you want to weigh in on China? Is this something where you can get Chinese cooperation in a meaningful way, or something you do without the Chinese? Thoughts on that, kind of open floor to the four of you.
Well, if I could, maybe I'll say a word on this. I think it's absolutely critical that the region as a whole, and Northeast Asia in particular, be aligned towards whatever kind of policies or resolution of the Korea issue is contemplated. The North Korea issue can certainly not be handled effectively and achieve any of these goals unless we have the cooperation, not just of the immediate parties involved, but of the Japanese and the Chinese in particular, as well as possibly other countries in the region, the Russians, who were part of the six-party talks originally, as we all know. None of these countries can be ignored in developing a strategy to deal with North Korea. And among them, the two most important, other than South Korea and the US, of course, are China and Japan. Having Japan and North and South Korea at each other's throats in some ways in recent months undermines this entire process. Japan and South Korea need to have close agreement on how to deal with North Korea. Japan's concerns are deep about what happens on the Korean Peninsula. If North Korea continues as a nuclear power and doesn't look like it's going to ever give up its nuclear weapons, this increases the security threat for Japan. So Japan has a strong incentive in achieving denuclearization on the peninsula, and short of that, in achieving some level of capping and controlling and some level of incentives on the part of North Korea to not provoke. And none of that can be done if there's not close coordination between Japan and South Korea. And then the Chinese, of course, are critical in all of this, in part because of their influence on North Korea, which is undetermined, but not nearly as great as many people think. Yet the Chinese do not want to see North Korea collapse in chaos, nor end up in war. They want North Korea to succeed economically and become more stable for their own interests. And so they are deeply committed to the idea of a process of diplomatic engagement, much along the lines of what we've been talking about, which is a kind of two-track system moving towards a peace regime on the one hand, while moving towards greater levels of security reassurance and the reduction of North Korea's nuclear capabilities on the other hand. The two of them are essential. One can't be seen as a hard precondition before the other. They both have to move to some degree in tandem, starting though with a peace declaration, which, as Jess and others have argued, and we argue in the report, would be an excellent first step in trying to move in that direction. And I think the Chinese would be, of course, very supportive of that. So this general sense, what we're talking about, I think would be supported by the Chinese, but we need to make sure that they are on board with this, and having a deep Sino-Chinese competition, Sino-American, pardon me, competition just undermines that potential over time. It undermines the possibilities of stability on the Korean Peninsula.
Congressman, I want to give you a chance. I understand you might have to leave us a little early. So I just want to make sure you have time to weigh in on your thoughts on the regional questions or any other interventions you wanted to make.
No, thank you. So regarding your question about extended deterrence, the Biden administration and Secretary of State Blinken have a very different view than the former administration. When we look at our allies, we view them as exactly that. They're our allies. They're not somehow our enemies. And with the former presidents, sometimes hard to tell how he viewed our allies. He would, in fact, go around, as you know, making quite offensive statements to a number of our allies. So I don't think the Biden administration is going to come in and all of a sudden start demanding South Korea for money for military bases in South Korea, for example. And I think the Biden administration is much more focused on alliances, on working with our allies, using a multilateral approach and alliance approach to try to achieve goals. So the Biden administration is much less likely to go it alone on any of these sort of issues where you can have a lot of conflict, whether it's Korean Peninsula or elsewhere in the world. And I think they're going to focus a lot more on extended deterrence, working with our allies to try to achieve just that.
And do you see Korea as North Korea as a policy area where the United States should be looking to cooperate with China, or you don't think that's a necessary element in making progress?
So as all of you know, one thing that happens in foreign policy is you just learn to segment, right? So there are a number of countries that we work with on all sorts of different issues, even though we may disagree with them on all sorts of other issues. With the Iran deal, for example, China was a critical partner of that deal. We also work with China on various other issues relating to going after terrorists or trying to make sure we continue to have good exchanges between both countries, whether it's cultural or chambers of commerce or so on. So you just sort of have to, I think, learn to work with countries on issues that they work with you on, and the ones that you disagree with, try to mitigate those disagreements. So yes, I do think the Biden administration would absolutely try to work with China on the North Korea issue.
Thank you. So Professor Moon, again, trying to bring in some of the Q&A and on these topics, which I know you have a lot to say about both the China piece and the Japan piece and how it fits with North Korea. Question from Michael Daly: to what extent is it in the interest of China that the U.S. is embroiled in controversy with North Korea? So an interesting kind of reversal. And maybe you could build off that, your thoughts on China cooperation, essential or not, and also what's the state of South Korea-Japan relations and working together on North Korea?
As Dr. Michael Swaine pointed out, in order to solve the North Korean nuclear problem, we need a multilateral approach too. There got to be revitalization of the six-party talks, but not assistant secretary level. I would propose in a summit level, six-party summit talk or Northeast Asian Security Summit talk. I think that is the only way we can address North Korean nuclear issue, and also that can be used as a very effective mechanism to, elevate the rising tension between Washington and Beijing. Therefore, my basic argument is this: instead of dumping the six-party talk away, I would suggest that we should bring back six-party talks, and there got to be some kind of Northeast Asian Security Summit talks. That is the only way we can, not perhaps the most effective way, to resolve difference between Japan and South Korea, and between US and China, and also North Korea will be much more assured about that approach if it is a summit level. Therefore, I would propose that as one option. In fact, Morton Halperin and some other, and Thomas Pickering, they have been suggesting that idea. And I hope that the Biden administration pay attention to the six-party summit talk.
Jessica, I want to turn to you, and we've got a question. I feel like that's that moment in Annie Hall when Woody Allen gets Marshall McLuhan, steps out of the line for the Woody Allen fans. Sig Hecker has a question for us. So Jessica, you get to answer Dr. Hecker's question. Very interesting one. While the Biden administration is doing its policy review, what is North Korea doing, both in thinking through its diplomacy and with its nuclear missile program? So Jessica, do you want to try to put yourself in the North Korean shoes? And then any other thoughts on that? Very interesting question.
Oh my goodness. Well, it's very hard to answer Dr. Hecker's question. He's an intimidating figure with his brain power and his history of working on this issue, including going to North Korea. So I'm sure he has much more insights than I do. But having never traveled to North Korea before, it's very difficult for me to ascertain what is going on. We just know from the public statements Kim Jong-un has made about US being its #1 enemy and so forth, that they're gearing up for, what seems to be this long haul fight, for survival. We also know that they're dealing with environmental disaster, pandemic, and of course the closure of their border, which has had an immensely, negative effect on their economy. And so this is a very tough time for ordinary North Koreans. And so it remains to be seen what, the regime will do to, retain and keep up its total control of society. It's, I think on a personal level, very difficult to watch because a lot of the photos and videos about North Korean people, remind me of my family, as a South Korean born American. And so it's very heartbreaking on a personal level. But, to Dr. Hecker's question about what the regime might be thinking and doing, it's anyone's guess. Obviously, there are a lot of analysts who ask those questions. And I think that's another reason why diplomacy is so crucial, because we have so few windows into the thinking of the regime. We don't know who to turn to. I only know one or two people who are regularly on track 2 meetings that Dr. Delury, you're part of, and others are part of in this meeting. So, we know so little. And I think that's very dangerous. And I think that at the end of the day is what really scares me as an American, the fact that we can be so close to a miscalculation that leads to something, as Congressman Lieu said, catastrophic.
And that's a very good point. I guess in this group, the person who was in the room with Kim Jong-un most recently would be Chung-in Moon, who was there. Do you want to try to give a shot at Dr. Hecker's question? What do you think? It's a very important one, as Jessica pointed out. What would you guess are they looking for? Where do you think they might be in terms of their thinking about the Biden administration? What are the possibilities moving forward?
I think that now President Kim Jong-un should be waiting for the outcome of policy review by the Biden administration. And I think the North Korea would not commit the same mistake of April 2009, when North Korea test-launched the rocket into space. Because since November 29, 2017, North Korea declared that it has a completely nuclear weapons capability. There is no reason for North Korea to show its power in order to bring the United States to the negotiation table. Therefore, this time, North Korea will be waiting for the American policy review very carefully. And at the same time, as Jessica pointed out, COVID-19 and the whole economic difficulties followed by the sanctions and etc. Those things could be the one factor, but the most important factor is, I would say that North Korea has become much more prudent, even rational in their decision. Otherwise, North Korea could have done that. Now, today is what, toward the end of February, then they could have done something, bad, but they didn't do that. Therefore, I would say that they are really deliberating on what the Biden administration policy on North Korea.
And giving some room. So we're nearly out of time. Congressman, I'm glad you're still with us. And actually we have a great South Korean, North Korea scholar, Paek Hak-sun, has a question that maybe you, Congressman, are best positioned to answer. He'd like some interpretation of U.S. intention, and specifically he asks about Secretary Blinken's comment about additional sanctions. And I think he's a little concerned that there's a stress on additional sanctions first, rather than diplomatic incentives. How are you reading the administration? Again, what is the discussion in Congress? What's your own thinking about sanctions and the role of sanctions in the toolbox of dealing with North Korea?
So thank you for that question. One reason I'm particularly excited about this term in Congress is when we hold these hearings, we're actually going to get administration officials to show up and they're going to testify and tell the American people what the administration is thinking. At this point, I honestly think that they are going through their policy review. I don't think they have come up with any sort of firm views or proposals as what is going to happen. So let's wait for that policy review to finish. I'm not exactly, I wouldn't actually know what Secretary Blinken is thinking at this exact moment in time. I do think they're going to deliberately and methodically go through that policy review. But I do want to take a step back and just say there's a huge, as Jessica mentioned, sort of humanity aspect to this. You have a lot of people suffering in North Korea, and we've all seen various documentaries and so on. It just is a mass amount of suffering. So I would generally sort of support things that could try to shake things up to try to get to a path forward towards a peace on the peninsula, just because it is just shocking how much suffering that we're experiencing in North Korea day after day.
Yeah, thank you for making that point. I mean, in the last minute, Chung-in, did you want to comment on some of the ideas here in Seoul about using humanitarianism and even the pandemic as a place to reinitiate diplomacy with North Korea involving the United States as well? Is that still a very active discussion by South Korean Blue House?
The humanitarian aid cannot be subject to, some kind of strategic calculus of the United States. Humanitarian, goal is an end in itself. It's teleological, and I really hope that the Biden administration would not, use humanitarian aid as a tool for diplomatic negotiation. Therefore, I would strongly urge the Biden administration to go for humanitarian assistance, which the Trump administration has been using as a bargaining tool.
Great. Well, with that, my timer just went off. So it's my role as timekeeper is to turn it back, Trita, to you to close our session. So I just want to, as moderator, thank all the panelists. I learned so much, and I really appreciated your insights. So thank you very much. Trita.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for a wonderful conversation. Thank you to all of the panelists, Congressman Lieu, Professor Moon, Jess, Michael, as well as yourself, John, for an excellent conversation. I think it brought us some hope. I think there's a tremendous amount of good points that were raised and opportunities that need to be explored. So we're going to keep on focusing on this issue, and hopefully we'll see some positive results. Before I let everyone go, I wanted to plug our next panel that will take place this Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, titled Toward a Worker-Centered China Policy, How to Make U.S.-China Trade Help Americans and the World. We will be joined by Anna Ashton of the U.S.-China Business Council, Jake Werner of Boston University, QI's own Rachel Espinodel, and it will be moderated by Graham Webster of Stanford University. For those of you who are not on our mailing list, please go to quincyins.org and sign up so you will get notifications of all of our panel discussions, as well as our publications and op-eds. But with that, thank you all so much for today, and I hope to see everyone on Thursday. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Professor Moon and Professor Delury. This was a fantastic conversation. I hope we can turn to you all soon again for another conversation.